And good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management. We are right squarely in the month of Brocktober. Big series of games coming up for Brock Bowers as he continues to propel UGA and perhaps also propels himself into the thick of the Heisman Trophy race by the time this month is done. That is what Brocktober is all about. We'll have more of that for you on our show here coming up in just a minute. Also, Jake Fromm in today's show. He'll share more thoughts about what he's been impressed with when it comes to Bowers. Mike Griffith today, too. We'll actually flip-flop the order of our guests today. Jake first, and we'll get Mike second. Mike helps us preview Georgia, Kentucky. Also a big event going down with Coach Richt here, the legendary former Georgia coach, in a couple of weeks. Mike's been a big part of getting all that together. We'll talk to Mike more about that here in just a little bit. Off the top of the show, though, Kirk Herbstreit, who we haven't been thrilled with at times over the course of the last few months, has said something pretty nice about Carson Beck that I think is interesting because it reflects a lot of what Georgia fans have also been saying there as well. I think it's a good place for us to start on today's show because it also sets us up for what we need to talk about as it relates to Georgia against Kentucky on Saturday. This is a good conversation. We're excited about doing it with you and glad to have you with us for it. And by the way, also before we're done today, I'm going to ask you to help me with something because we got a little bit of an issue out there again, and I'm going to need your help on this. So we'll do that here coming up in just a little bit too. I'll tell you more about it then. It's super complicated and very annoying, but I'm going to ask you for your help nonetheless anyway here in just a little bit. All right, so that's coming up, but for now, it is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Breda Pest Management, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Breda Pest Management, the official pest control of UGA Athletics.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
One of the guys who's been a little bit of a villain for us in the show over the last couple of months is in kind of the hero role a little bit today. I want to share this with you for two different reasons because I think it's interesting on both accounts. And our buddy Mike Griffith had written a story about this the other day at DawgNation.com. We'll talk to Mike later on. We may even bring this up with Mike. But a lot of these like national analysts, like the guys that do the games on television, one of the things they like to do is sort of share some kind of like, I guess you call them like capsulized bullet point type stuff on the various teams. They share their rankings, things like that. And the other day, as ESPN's Kirk Herbstreit was sharing a few things about college football weekend that was, he said something about Carson Beck that I could not help but notice. I want to show you this on the screen, read it to you, and then that's going to set us up for a conversation that I want us to have about Georgia football here today. This is what Herbstreit said on Twitter. He updates his top four after week 5. He's got Florida State at number 4, Washington at number 3, Texas at number 2. He's got Georgia right now at number 1. And his explanation for Georgia here right now, or his description of what he saw from Georgia in winning a game that was slightly closer than the experts thought it would be against Auburn is, hey, the young quarterback Carson Beck grew up yesterday. Now, this is what I think is interesting about this. It's not very many words. There's not a whole lot to it. But it's interesting for me that Kirk Herbstreit says what he says for two reasons here. Herbstreit is still the most recognizable voice around the sport. We think he's spread too thin. We think his college football opinions kind of reflect that. But nonetheless, Herbstreit is still the most recognizable voice in college football. And at one point in time, over the course of the offseason, expressing some skepticism about Georgia, kind of touting Alabama, which seems like a little bit of an old tired tale, but nonetheless, he was doing that. And we kind of took our shots at Herbstreit when he was saying all that kind of stuff. Yeah, here we are after 5 weeks of the season, a guy who started the year off with a little bit of skepticism of Georgia, now looks at the landscape through 5 games. Alabama's already lost. Perhaps Michigan, Ohio State, not as impressive to Herbstreit. One way or another, he's got Georgia at number 1. Now, this to me is important context. Not because Herbstreit's the be-all, end-all of opinions. We have plenty of reason to disagree with him. I'm sure you do there as well. Herbstreit's just a guy with a loud, sort of big platform, loud megaphone. He is not necessarily the ultimate tastemaker when it comes to kind of this kind of stuff, but it is additional context for some Georgia fans who look at the landscape around Georgia football right now, and they are concerned. Defense giving up more rushing yards than they're used to seeing. Slow starts on offense. More on that here in a moment. Seeing some blemishes with Georgia that seem pretty uncustomary compared to the last 2 national championship teams. A lot of Georgia fans asking the question of, oh my gosh, what's wrong with UGA? And even using some of those concerns to perhaps convinced themselves that Georgia has some sort of fatal flaw that prevents greatness from occurring here this particular year. Obviously, the future is yet to be determined. We don't know how this season is going to end for Georgia. But if you're a Georgia fan whose concern has risen to the level of assumption that Georgia won't have another national championship season, perhaps Kirk Herbstreit here can be a little bit of a response to you on all of that, that, hey, a guy who did not have Georgia number one to begin the season, after seeing Georgia for 5 games and also seeing everybody else play for 5 games, Herbstreit, who's been kind of an open skeptic of UGA, he has Georgia at number one right now. And I think that ought to matter to you here a little bit. The other reason that I bring up what Herbstreit says is because Herbstreit's words right there reflect so much of what we heard on our DawgNation postgame show from the field at Jordan-Hare Stadium on Saturday night, where I thought a lot of Georgia fans had very interesting responses, most of them similar, in the fact they all said some form or version of what Herbstreit said there, that Carson Beck grew up. And I believe that Carson Beck, even though he threw an interception and even though he could have hit Oscar Delp and perhaps would have been a long touchdown pass, even though there were a couple of miscues that were easily noticeable, the fact is, after all of that, Beck made some very big throws for Georgia in the second half, made some very big throws for Georgia on third downs, that Carson Beck really won over a good degree of the Georgia fan base, which at times, let's be honest, like all SEC and passionate fan bases, at times, this is a bunch that can be a little bit difficult to win over. Perhaps we ourselves in this show at times are a little bit difficult to fully win over. But Carson Beck seems like on Saturday night was starting to win over a good portion of Georgia fans. And part of the reason why I shared the Herbstreit tweet, just a small number of words, but the Herbstreit language there very much reflects what a lot of Georgia fans feel like they've seen from Beck there too. That he's kind of growing up. He's becoming sort of a, to borrow a phrase, kind of a man in full here as the Georgia starting quarterback. He's just kind of settling in. This just sort of starts to feel like his team, and right now the confidence that UGA fans have in Beck is growing, which I think leads to an appropriate question. All right, well, what's next? If he's passed the first test, which was final win against an SEC team, that was South Carolina, come from behind win in that game, by the way, may have counted as the second test. Third test for Beck is, okay, well, you've done it at home. Now can you go out and do it on the road? Beck passed that test. As Kirby Smarts pointed out, there weren't any kind of procedural penalties. Beck didn't seem shaken or rattled, seemed very much cool, calm, and in control. That's the third test passed. What is the next test for Carson Beck to pass, as he, to use the words of Kirk Herbstreit, as he continues to fully grow up and fully mature into the role of a Georgia starting quarterback, not just for any team, but a team that has aspirations of winning the national championship? What is next for Carson Beck? Here's what I'd suggest. I guess you can say in a roundabout way, facing a ranked opponent here this upcoming Saturday night is sort of the next new thing that Beck's doing for the first time. But beyond that, I think the next big job for Carson Beck, or the next big test for him to pass as he grows into the role of the Georgia starting quarterback, is he's got to be a part of the solution to some of the things that are plaguing Georgia here right now. And while Herbstreit works for ESPN, said some really nice things about Beck, another of Herbstreit's ESPN colleagues, a little bit more pointed in his criticism of Georgia this week. Connor Riley wrote a story about this at DawgNation.com. A little bit of a somewhat harsh evaluation of Georgia offensively after where it is after these 5 games. Bill Conley, sort of one of those, and I say this lovingly, but sort of math nerd type guys, super into all the analytics, the advanced stats type stuff. Apparently, Conley doesn't like as much from Georgia right now as Herbstreit seems to think that he likes about UGA. Let me read to you from Connor's story here at DawgNation.com. Starting off with Connor's words. As for why Georgia hasn't always looked the part of being the number one team, ESPN's Bill Conley laid out his thoughts. He ranked Georgia, listen to this, number 5 of the unbeaten teams left in college football. So Herbstreit's got Georgia number 1, but of unbeaten teams, Conley, using his sort of math nerd calculator stuff, only has Georgia 5th behind Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, and Washington. Now here's the quote from Bill Conley, ESPN.com. Connor wrote about this at DawgNation. Slow starts and no big plays. Conley says that big plays create easy points. and Georgia ranks just 81st in marginal explosiveness, whatever that is. 107th in rushing, 71st in passing when that category. Combine that, Conley says, with some dreadful starts despite a soft schedule. The Dogs' first quarter scoring margin is only 0.0, which is that's the line from is it Animal House? 0.0, yeah. That's Georgia's scoring margin here in the first quarter thus far this season, meaning they've scored 17 points. They've allowed 17 points thus far in the first quarter here this season. Conley says that's worst of any team in the AP Top 20. Conley concludes by saying, with all that being true, you've got a team that has to work for quite a long time to get up on opponents as they should. Now, I don't agree with everything that Conley says there when it comes to things like marginal explosiveness. I'm not even sure I understand that. But if you're going to say they rank low in marginal explosiveness, that certainly appears to me to be directionally true, even if I can't, explain and describe the specific accuracy of it, because we are not seeing a great deal of explosive plays from Georgia. And the statement that Conley uses there about the big plays create easy points, you've heard me say that many times already this season. We evaluate the Georgia offense, that you got to have the explosive plays that lead to points, because the points eventually lead to wins. And against SEC competition, it's just true. Georgia needs to score more points against the SEC teams that it plays, not to rack up style points or impressive wins, beauty contest type stuff, but because oftentimes these performances offensively against the sort of more stout teams on your schedule become pretty strong predictors of how you'll do later on in the games that matter most. Georgia's averaged 37 points per game against SEC foes in each of the last two national championship seasons. That gives you an idea of just how good Georgia's been, in that regard. And right now they're well below that. And so Carson Beck has passed all the tests that he's been given thus far this year. He has won his first SEC game, won his first road game, come from behind a couple of times now. Kirk Herbstreit says he's growing up. Seems like that's true. So the next step in his growth towards fully being the Georgia starting quarterback, the next step in his maturity is you got to fix some of this kind of stuff. You got to be turned loose maybe, or perhaps just finding a way to be slightly more effective to create the kind of explosive plays that do allow you to score more points, that do allow you to get more of the kind of easy wins that Georgia has made the sort of the defining characteristic of its last two national championship seasons. And as Conley alludes to, some of that a little earlier in the game, where right now Georgia's just sort of flat-footed even with the teams that it's playing through the first 15 minutes, some of that would also be kind of a nice thing there as well. But you may not necessarily care as much about like an ESPN talking head, math nerd, calculator type guy saying this, but you're probably a little bit more interested in what Kirby Smart has to say about this. And even though Smart describes it maybe a slightly different way, Smart, as recently as last night, also once again openly acknowledged that Georgia does need to be better offensively at the beginning of the game, but also just throughout the game overall. This is how Smart chose to say that last night.
Absolutely, we need to improve it. But, we look at everything. And, I think we went 3 and out one time on offense. Every other time we move the ball, which that's what you want to do. Obviously, you want to score, but you want to move the ball so you can create field position. On defense, we've gone 3 and out maybe once or twice. We did last week. So it's not the first possession, but it is the first quarter, and some of that has been circumstance of missing a field goal. Some of that has been circumstances of we defer, so if we win the toss, we never get that extra possession in the first quarter because they get it. But those are all just excuses. I mean, we got to play better. There's a lot of reasons why it happens. I've been years where you score every first possession and you stop them every time, and then for a while we were like we couldn't get it started in third quarter. We could never get any momentum going in the third quarter, and we were awful in the third quarter. One of the years we won a national championship, but it's something you try to address and think about the way you start the game, but don't overthink it because we're trying to plan for the whole game.
That's a small point, but I do think it's really important that while we kind of fixate on the fact that weirdly it's been the first quarters of games which Georgia had the biggest issue, the truth is that it's really more about the total number of points scored per game, the total number of big plays collected during the game that result in the kind of scores that give Georgia a chance to have some slightly easier wins. It seems like a lot of this is clustered in the first quarter, but if you fixate on how do you start faster, I think you perhaps miss the larger story, which is how do you just be better offensively in general? Forget the fact for a moment it's all clustered in, or at least a lot of it's clustered at one particular time during the game, and just look at the larger big picture of against a team like Kentucky, who this year has actually produced more plays of 20 or more yards than Georgia has, despite the fact that Kentucky plays slower than just about anybody in the country. How do you produce the kind of explosive offense on Saturday that gives you a chance to get the kind of easy-ish, anyway, 2-touchdown win that the experts think you're supposed to have against the Wildcats? Well, Carson Beck, I believe, plays a big role in making that happen on Saturday. And the good news is, when everybody looks at Beck right now, it certainly seems like a lot of people are seeing some version of the same thing. Georgia fans were pretty happy with Beck after the game against Auburn on Saturday. He earned some, at times, difficult-to-earn praise from UGA fans for how he performed. Kirk Herbstreit, who's kind of viewing this more from a sort of a 10,000-foot perspective, he had some nice things to say about Beck there as well. Everybody seems to be saying something pretty similar. Looks like he's growing up. Looks like he's becoming more comfortable in the role of Georgia's starting quarterback. Well, Saturday night, the big stage against a ranked opponent who also happens to be undefeated, coming off a big win against Florida, Saturday night is a great opportunity for Carson Beck to show the next phase, the next development of that maturity. Go out, make some big throws, connect on some big completions, get some explosive plays, score more points. And if that happens, perhaps Georgia takes the next step towards being the kind of dominant elite team that we expect the Dogs will be before the season comes to a close. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Breda Pest Management. We're glad to have you with us, no matter how you get to us. Video, 10 a.m. across all video platforms, 9:45, First and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app, radio noon, Athens, Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast all over the place. By the way, specific message for those that listen via podcast or who know someone who does. This is coming up in a second. It's massively complicated, but I'm going to walk you through this, something pretty important here in a moment. I'm going to try not to bore you to tears, especially for those that are not impacted by this at all. That's coming up in a moment. Prior to that, though, big thanks to Breda Pest Management, who make this show possible, because all these platforms, we try to be on them all, and we try to function, well on all of them. Breda Pest Management making that possible for us here today. And, of course, I know Matt and the entire team over there at Breda Pest Management, they're also very excited about Brocktober as well, which we are in here right now. More on Brocktober here in a little bit, too. But Breda Pest Management, they're the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. They're going to be keeping bugs and critters, and including the Wildcats, out of Sanford Stadium on Saturday, at least out of the end zone, hopefully anyway, on Saturday, because Breda Pest Management takes care of all of UGA's athletic facilities, keeping them termite-free, bug and critter-free, flying squirrels, things like that. I don't know if flying squirrels are getting into Sanford Stadium. I certainly hope not, but they can get into your house, and if that becomes the case, you want the folks at Breda Pest Management to help you get rid of them, because in Georgia, stuff like that can kind of happen from time to time. Or perhaps for you, it's a little bit more simple, straightforward type deal. Maybe you're just tired of whatever company you're working with because your cost of service keeps going up. You get that letter in your mail, termite coverage getting more expensive. Everything seems to be getting more expensive, so finding a way to save money when you can, really important. That is what Breda Pest Management helps you do. So find them online, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com. One more time, BredaPest.com, B-R-E-D-A, BredaPest.com. They're going to put more money back in your pocket just for making the switch. That's why I love recommending them, because if I can save you money, I want to. That's how much I care for you. And our friends at Breda Pest Management are going to give you a chance to do that, the official pest control provider of UGA Athletics. Okay, before I get into everything else coming up in the show, let me talk here for a moment. And you know the meme of former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders, whether you like his politics or not, but you know the meme where he's like, I'm once again here asking you to blah, 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 blah. You may have seen that meme before. Well, I'm sort of the Bernie Sanders meme here for a moment of, I am once again here asking you to help me out with something as it relates to the podcast. You may remember like a year ago, or if it was 2 years ago, I honestly can't remember if it was last year or the year before last, we had an issue with our Apple podcast subscribers. And we have, apparently, based on some feedback that I'm getting, something going on with that again. But here's where things get complicated. The last time we had this, everybody was impacted. Anybody who subscribed via Apple was impacted. This time, the best that I can tell is only some people are impacted by this. Now, this is super complicated, and I realize it's also kind of boring if you're not impacted by this, so I apologize, but this is important to me. So would you tolerate me talking about some kind of boring procedural stuff for like a few more seconds? Now, you may be wondering, well, how can only some people be impacted by this? Because for years now, and this is very weird, for years now, we have had two different DawgNation Daily podcast feeds. It was a total accident, happened a few years ago, but we've got so many subscribers on both these feeds that it doesn't make any sense to try to do anything about it because they don't know about the other feed, and it's a total mess, and a lot of things like that just from early years just never quite get cleaned up. So here's what I'm going to tell you. If you have not been getting the DawgNation Daily podcast feed, now if you haven't been getting it, perhaps you're not hearing me right now, here's what you can do. First of all, this is going on year 9 of doing this show. There have been 2 days in the history of this show we didn't have a show. There was a snow day one day, like way back in 2017, and there was one day last year where finally, for the very first time in DawgNation Daily history, I had the flu or whatever, and I missed a day of the show last year. I've had one sick day in 9 years. We had a snow day one time, like however many years ago, 7 years ago, whatever that was. And that's it. Other than that, we never missed a day. So if the show doesn't show up, it's not because we're not here, because we are never not here, to use a double negative. So there's always something weird going on if the show doesn't show up. We never miss a show. We don't miss shows. I don't get sick. I don't get headaches. I don't feel discomfort. We don't miss shows. So always know that something's weird if the show doesn't show up. But the second thing is if you have been in any way impacted by this, you can either do this. You can go search for DawgNation Daily in Apple, find the other podcast feed, click in there, and the shows have been loading just fine, the best that I can tell. You can also listen via Spotify, which I think functions pretty well, any of the video players, directly through SoundCloud. There's a lot of platforms we try to make the show on. So I realize that's mega complicated and tedious and boring, but that's the issue there. Now, here's my request. If someone's impacted by this, there's a very good chance they're not listening to us right now. So, and I said this the same thing a year or two ago. We're going to do this like high attendance Sunday at the Baptist church when you're growing up. We're going to go out and we're going to do some outreach on the backsliders and get them back in here. So if you know somebody that listens via the Apple Podcast player, I want you to tell them, BA told this long, complicated spiel about an issue that's affecting some people via DawgNation Daily on Apple, and he had this whole complicated thing about how to go find the show if you're not getting it. Now, eventually, we're going to get it fixed for both of the subscriber groups within Apple, but for now, they may have to go find the other feed in Apple or listen on Spotify or one of the video platforms that we're on. And now we actually archive the show every day at DawgNation.com, which is actually something we've been doing for a couple of months and I haven't made too big of a deal about, but it's also easier than ever to find the show because the video is now archived at DawgNation.com, a site that you're probably already visiting on a regular basis anyway. So I've talked about this too long. We've probably, kind of lost some people in the midst of all of this. But just one more time, some Apple Podcast subscribers have been impacted by I don't even know what. I never understand any of this stuff. So if you know somebody who does like to listen via Apple, do me a huge favor. Try to help them out. Tell them what I said. They can either find it on the other DawgNation Daily that's floating around the Apple search function somewhere, Spotify, on video, including now archived at DawgNation.com. And if any of that doesn't make sense, hit me up, HMU, and I will try to help you and walk through that. And by the way, to those of you who are always kind enough to point out to me when something goes wrong, and unfortunately, that's not an infrequent occurrence. But when something does go wrong, a few of you always, hey, BA, just want you to know, blah, blah, blah. I am so, so grateful for those of you who do that. Thank you very much. And with that, we're going to move on and actually start talking about what we're paid to talk about, which is Georgia football. So before we're done, it's Mike Griffith here. Mike will give us an update on everything going on in practice this week as Georgia gets ready for Kentucky on Saturday. Jake Fromm coming up in a couple of minutes. We're actually going to kind of shake things up and do Jake a little earlier here than we typically do because Jake's got some really good things to say today. And before that, let's go around the doghouse. Poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And after all that long, complicated spiel a moment ago, I could use a Dr. Pepper right now. But the thing that will get me back in a good mood is not just Dr. Pepper. It's also the month of Brocktober there as well. And we feel great about Brocktober right now because the thing that we're enjoying is the level of attention that Brock is getting. We think well-deserved. And the whole point of Brocktober is 3 games this month. Kentucky, Pat's standing game against Vanderbilt, big platform, 3:30 CBS for the rivalry game against Florida. By the time Brocktober comes to an end, we think that Brock Bowers could not only be right in the thick of the Heisman race, he may actually be the Heisman leader by the end of this month based on the way that he's playing now and based on the momentum that seems to be growing in terms of Brock getting a lot of very appropriate attention. That's just a fun thing to consider here. And Brock has been a great player now for 2 years at Georgia, but Georgia has had so many great players the last couple of years. Oftentimes, greatness hides in plain sight, and perhaps it's not always been super easy to observe just how great Brock Bowers has been. But moving into this year, a little bit different kind of Georgia team, a little bit different category of player for Brock now. All of a sudden, he's getting the kind of individual attention that he probably doesn't want. In fact, he definitely doesn't want it. Georgia has never really sought out for any of its individual players. But in terms of the level of achievement that Brock continues to unlock week after week after week, something that's absolutely, totally appropriate. And I tell you, we said this at the time. We get plenty wrong, but one thing we got right way back in July is that SEC Media Days was a very important week for Brock Bowers because it was at that particular event that a lot of media people were introduced to Bowers for the first time, and the level of coverage, the level of attention he's gotten since then has been at a different level than it was before. Not to Bowers' liking, he doesn't seek out the spotlight, but sometimes it's our job to shine the spotlight on guys who are just doing it to a higher degree, and no one's doing it to a better level than what Brock Bowers is right now. And at that event yesterday, a guy named Brad Crawford, who writes for 24/7 Sports, I'm going to show you this on the screen, what Crawford wrote on Twitter. He said yesterday, is Brock Bowers a legitimate Heisman contender? So you're seeing a lot of these writers, national-type guys, Bowers, Heisman, same sentence. That's kind of the whole deal about Brocktober right now. This is working. Brad says, going back to SEC Media Days, I asked him what it would take to win the award. Right now, Crawford says that Bowers leads number one Georgia with 30 catches, 413 receiving yards, and 3 total touchdowns. So way back in July, what did Bowers say about the possibility that he might win the Heisman Trophy? Something that is very realistic, I believe, here right now. These are the typically not shy maybe, but certainly humble and demure words from Bowers on that particular topic. Here is Brock on the notion that he could win the Heisman Trophy.
If you're that guy this season, what kind of year would it take out of you to be a finalist for that award?
Yeah, I think it would take a lot, just because tight end positional value isn't super high usually, and like I said earlier, quarterbacks. I mean, they're usually the best player on the field because they need to be kind of the field general, and that's why they usually win the award. So it would take a lot this year for me to do that.
Has Mike Bobo told you at all that you're going to get the football in a different sort of role, hybrid type role?
Yeah, I think he'll use me a lot like Coach Munkin did, and kind of throw a few of his own wrinkles in there. But I'll be happy with whatever helps the team win.
So there you go. So way back in July, it was even being discussed then, Brock Bowers saying, hey, it's kind of a quarterback's award, hard to do, but ultimately I just want to do what is needed to be done to help the team win. But right now, this is a different kind of Georgia team, and all of a sudden the definition of do what's needed to help Georgia win, that's a little bit more of the superstar type turn we saw Bowers take in the second half against Auburn the other day. And that's why this entire thing, I think right now, is real and legitimate. Now, honestly, I'm a wrestling, commentator, circus ringmaster type. I'd probably be shouting this from the heavens whether it was true or not, perhaps anyway. But in this particular case, this is real and this is genuine. Brock Bowers right now is introducing himself to the entire country as the best player in the entire sport. And on Saturday night against Kentucky, we think Georgia takes another step, and Bowers himself helps lead the way in all of that. It is his month, after all. Welcome to Brocktober. And that is Around the Doghouse, poured today by our friends at Dr. Pepper. And we love college football. We love the fact that Dr. Pepper loves college football because we also love Dr. Pepper there, too. You're watching those Fansville commercials. You're experiencing everything that's going on there with that, and you need to experience the great taste of Dr. Pepper for your tailgate, for your watch party, wherever you're getting together with college football fans, or as you're enjoying our show each and every day here, pop the top on a Dr. Pepper and enjoy that there too. Whether it be the zero sugar, the brand new Dr. Pepper strawberries and cream, just the regular old Dr. Pepper, whatever your favorite is, it's the rich, delicious, one-of-a-kind flavor of Dr. Pepper that goes great with game day. Dr. Pepper is truly the one that fans deserve. All right, so check that out today. Really good stuff on all of that. All right, it's Mike Griffith before we're done. Mike's got some interesting things to say about Georgia playing Kentucky on Saturday. Also, Mike pretty instrumental in helping us get together for a really, really cool event taking place later on in a couple of weeks with the former beloved Georgia football coach Mark Richt. We'll tell you all about that here coming up in just a little bit too. But for now, more on Bowers, his Heisman candidacy, and the performance that he's had thus far this season. What's it going to take to beat Kentucky on Saturday? And how about the nature of this Georgia offense now and the role that Carson Beck is playing in all of that? Let's talk to a guy who's had the same job that Beck now has. The starting quarterback for the Georgia Bulldogs. At one point in time, Jake Fromm knew what that felt like, and he joins us now as part of a Kroger Fresh Take here on DawgNation Daily today. And here on our Kroger Fresh Take, time to talk to the former Georgia quarterback, Jake Fromm. Happy to have him here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Kroger here today. Jake, thanks so much for your time, and I guess congratulations. Commanders get a 17-15 win against the Cleveland Browns there last week. Appreciate you being a part of the show, and congratulations on being a part of a preseason win there.
Yeah, Brandon, thank you for having me. It's always fun to win a ball game, especially in this league, and man, just excited to go to work this week and move on to the next.
So you completed 5 passes there in the win. I'll admit I haven't really gotten to see any of the highlights or anything like that. How did you feel like your performance kind of went there for that game in the Commanders, for the Commanders?
It was it was fun to be out on the field again, especially with the guys. Man, we've been working really hard, and man, it was just fun to let a few loose and man, just get out there and play under the lights.
I saw where you guys are, I guess, having joint practices with the Ravens right now ahead of a battle of the Beltway sort of on Monday night there, and a little bit of pushing and shoving, maybe a little bit of guys having to be separated this week. It's that time of year, right? It gets hot out there at practice. We see this at the college level, of course, too, but at the NFL level, you get those joint practices. Sometimes those tempers get a little short out there, don't they?
Yeah, it's tough, man. You know, like you said, it's that time of year. You know, guys are getting dialed in, getting riled up, and man, sometimes competitive spirits get the best of some guys. But man, it's just guys just want to compete and try to do their best.
One of the things that when you look at Georgia football here that I kind of found impressive here this week, ESPN has come out with its ranking of the top players in all of college football. They've got the 100 top players there, and coming in at number 2 on the list is Georgia tight end Brock Bowers. And to me, you know, Jake, this is just such an amazing thing to consider that Bowers, who's a tight end, you wouldn't think of necessarily a player like that possibly being the, top-rated player, a guy that I would think legitimately maybe even has a chance to win the Heisman Trophy. Tight end's not always a position we think about that, being that kind of position, but obviously that's the kind of success Brock Bowers has had. What does it say about him that he could take a position like tight end, not typically thought to be among the very best players, and have a chance to be kind of recognized that way here this year for Georgia?
Yeah, I mean, he's a dynamic football player, and he can take a position like tight end and really have a huge influence on the outcome of football games, and which is why he is well respected, which is why he, has the accolades that he has, is because he can change the game from that position. There's just very few guys that can really have that big of an outcome on the game like he does. It's going to be really exciting to see, what he does this year, how he's able to influence the game, how they game plan with him, where they move him around, how much does he touch the ball. It's going to be some really fun stuff to watch because I think he's just tore up with a ton of ability. And he's going to be able to impact games in a really big way.
There's a little bit of a different storyline kind of playing out for Georgia right now than what we might typically be used to. On paper right now, it seems like Georgia may have the best crop of receivers to begin a season that's possibly had. And you and I have talked about that before, how good this wide receiver situation looks like it could be for Georgia here this year. Conversely, though, Kendall Milton's dealing with an injury. Branson Robinson's dealing with an injury. Maybe Georgia right now feels like it's a little bit less proven overall at the running back spot. My question for you is this. How much can Georgia lean on the quality it thinks it has at wide receiver as a way of kind of bolstering the offense while it tries to figure out what it has at running back? Can the wide receivers be an aid to this running situation right now that's probably right now a little bit more of a work in progress?
Yeah, I think so. I think they will help with the situation too, but I also think it really comes down to, the offensive line play and how they play. If they open up holes, I mean, there's gaps that I can run through and I can gain 15 yards, the way they're able to move people, scheme people up, it's really going to make it easy for whoever's taking the ball there at running back. So I think they'll be fine. But receiver core, absolutely. Brock for sure. But I think it's really going to come down to how the offensive line plays.
We've talked about this before when you stepped in as Georgia quarterback in 2017. That was one of the things that I think Kirby Smart probably put his stamp on this team with. Probably the quickest of anything is you saw major improvement along the offensive line. Your buddy Andrew Thomas, also a fellow freshman there that year, but also guys like Isaiah Wynn. All right. Well, there you go. That's not the right interview. So there you go. All right. So apologize for that. Very, very sorry. We recorded with Jake yesterday, but that ain't it. So we will do this. We're going to do SEC through here in a moment. We're going to talk to Mike live and in person coming up here in just a little bit. An absolutely, totally tough situation there on that, and we're just going to roll right through it. We are going to roll right through it with a smile on our face. So let's do this. We're going to get Mike here coming up in a minute. I'm going to kind of just sort of regroup with my mind and just sort of be at peace and just sort of be as happy as I always am, because there is a very, very fun slate of action coming up on Saturday in the SEC and across college football. We're going to talk more about that and everything else. So sorry about Jake Fromm. I enjoy hearing from Jake every week. I promise you we had a great recorded interview with him yesterday, but who knows where it is. So there you go. And with that, we'll go ahead and do our SEC through.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, so Mike Griffith coming up. We'll talk to him about Georgia, Kentucky, and we will get ready for that here in just a little bit. But we also want to get ready right now to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And when things are not great, and unfortunately, frequently they are, I like to kind of think of myself being just in the Caribbean. And you close your eyes, and you're like sitting there either on the deck of a Royal Caribbean cruise ship, or perhaps you're one of the great places that Royal Caribbean visits, such as Perfect Day Coco Cay. When you got something like that going on, it is just so nice to kind of envision either times you've had in the past when you've been on a great Royal Caribbean cruise vacation, or sometime you're going to have in the future on board a Royal Caribbean cruise ship. That just kind of brings me back to peace. In fact, let me think right now about April of 2024, because you've heard us talk about this before. The DawgNation cruise coming up April of 2024 on board Allure of the Seas. Cannot wait for that. Bigger and better than it's ever been before. And we've already had so many people, literally hundreds of people, have already kind of signed up to be a part of this next generation DawgNation cruise taking place April of 2024, but there's still some space for you. Now, it's space limited. See, here's the deal. When it comes to Royal Caribbean cruise vacations right now, and this is not a joke, I'm being serious, the demand for the cruise ships themselves is so popular right now that we can only secure so much space for our DawgNation cruise right now. And once that space is gone, then we can have no more we can go to. And you have to be a part of the DawgNation cruise to take advantage and be a part of the special DawgNation themed event. So Jessica Slater, you've heard me talk about her before, terrific travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean. And she's got a website that she's put together that gives you all the information you need to know about the DawgNation cruise. You can find it online, royaldogs.com. That's royaldogs.com. You can find that there and find out everything you need to know about the DawgNation cruise. Where we're going, Perfect Day Coco Cay, Nassau in the Bahamas, what we're doing, even more specially themed DawgNation events than we've ever done before. That is all on deck there for April of 2024. Royaldogs.com gives you all the information you need to know on that. All right, interesting time here around Georgia high school football. Obviously, that's something I care about. And some of the goings-on with Georgia high school football this week also have big impacts on those of us who like college football there as well. First of all, there was an announcement about a brand new way to classify and divide teams here moving forward. Right now, the state of Georgia has up to 7 classifications. The highest classification in Georgia is known as 7A. Moving forward next year, they're going to have a little bit of a truncating, kind of a combining of some of the classifications. The highest classification will now be 6A. And part of the reason why they do that is because when you spread out all those various classifications, you have smaller regions, which creates more regular season stuff that require more travel, but also smaller regions require more need to schedule non-region games. Puts a little bit of a strain on the coaches, so making larger regions creates a little bit of a scheduling advantage for teams. It's just easier to get your 10-game regular season schedule, and so that is one of the things that's going on here, moving to that 6A classification, or 6 classifications, the highest classification being 6A. But the GHSA this week has also announced they're going to do something brand new with their private schools, which is 3A and below will now be combined to play for one state championship. Those private schools in the lower classification will continue to participate in the same regions with other teams, but they'll compete for their own state championship away from some of the other public schools. And how you handle the public and privates has been very, very complicated the last few years. And I don't know that anybody's particularly satisfied with how this is working out here right now, which maybe that's the sign of a good compromise when nobody's fully happy. But it seems like that's one of those things that's going to continue to be discussed. Now, in addition to that, you've also got the announcement this week that the Georgia High School Association has granted some leeway for high school players to start cashing in on NIL, name, image, likeness, the same way that college athletes can do. One thing that's going to be different about high school NIL compared to college NIL is that while college says, hey, there's no pay for play, but functionally it kind of operates as if there is, it seems like the high school folks are going to take this a little bit more seriously. The actual schools themselves can't have collectives, and they can't be paying for on-field incentives, things like that. This is really supposed to be, now I use air quotes around supposed to be, because ultimately, a lot of this stuff, sometimes is sort of said to be one thing, ends up kind of being something completely different. It is supposed to be, one of those things for only the top athletes who have a lot of measurable NIL value, the likes of which kind of the high 5-star and 4-star prospects, things like that. This is really just supposed to be for them to not have to wait to kind of cash in on all that. We'll see what kind of unintended consequences there turn out to be on this, because in almost everything, anywhere, anytime, there are some degree of unintended consequences. So we will see what those end up being for this. But there is a new horizon here with Georgia high school football. The allowance for some NIL payments for some high school athletes. Georgia out in front of some other states that Florida doesn't have this yet, although I believe they're working towards it. Alabama doesn't have this. Texas doesn't have this. Carolinas, I think, haven't done this yet. Some states do. Some states don't. So Georgia kind of moving to the forefront, at least with some of the states it typically competes with in terms of the supremacy of high school football and kind of paving the way for some of the NIL stuff. So that is that. Let me also give you a couple thoughts here on some of the big games of the upcoming weekend. We're obviously talking a lot about Georgia, Kentucky, and we will continue to do so. But there are other games of note on Saturday that are definitely worth your time. And we're going to learn a lot more about where, especially here in the SEC, where some of these teams stand moving into this particular weekend. I think undefeated Missouri hosting LSU is fascinating. Now, I get the impression that a lot of people have kind of turned their back forever on LSU because of how bad their defense performed last week against Ole Miss. You certainly understand that, and a lot of folks really like what Missouri's been able to do. One of the surprising undefeated teams, at least at this point in the schedule, and perhaps that continues. If it does, if Missouri finds a way to beat LSU, and right now, given LSU's really difficulty stopping anyone, if that be the case, then all of a sudden there's potentially more hype for the Georgia-Missouri game in a couple of weeks, or at least beginning in November, because if Missouri wins this one, they could win the next couple there as well. There's potentially more hype for an undefeated Missouri coming in later in the year, first Saturday in November, than there is right now for an undefeated Kentucky team coming in, because it'll just be much later in the year. So I think what you need is a reconsidering right now the Georgia schedule. This was thought to be the weakest, softest schedule on paper that any kind of national championship contender had played in quite some time. Certainly what's viewed to be the SEC frontrunner, a weaker schedule than they'd played at any point in time, at least in recent memory. And all of a sudden now you have to say that doesn't exactly feel so true anymore. Saturday, Georgia plays its first ranked opponent of the year, but you look ahead in future weeks, Kentucky is one of 4 ranked opponents currently on the Georgia schedule. And if Missouri wins against LSU, which admittedly is going to be a tough task, Missouri's still about a touchdown underdog here in this spot. But if they were to find a way to win, all of a sudden Georgia-Missouri becomes a very big deal, assuming that Missouri keeps that up prior to playing that game to begin the month of November. I also think Alabama-Texas A&M is a very big deal and a very, very interesting football game. And, some folks, don't participate in our live chats and our comment sections and things like that, but for those who do, one of the things you're well aware of is kind of a long-time joke around here is early days of Jimbo Fisher at Texas A&M. I was a pretty big believer in Jimbo as a guy who I thought could be a transformational figure for that program. I thought it was a huge coup for A&M to have been able to hire a national championship winning coach, spending big to bring in a big name. Seemed like a pretty good investment for me on the part of Texas A&M, and I predicted big things for Jimbo while at A&M. Obviously, that has not worked out. That's not been the case. And yet this week with A&M, given the fact that it played Alabama very close a year ago, beat them in 2021, It sort of feels like on Saturday, this may be another chance for Jimbo Fisher to actually do something pretty big with Texas A&M. The point spread's pretty narrow here. Alabama's only about a 2.5-point favorite on the road in College Station. Obviously, A&M's lost this year to Miami, but Miami looks like a pretty good football team. So A&M's ability to kind of shake that off, move on from that, seems like they're kind of doing that. And like the one thing that A&M sort of seems like it has going for it is a pair of receivers right now in Evan Stewart and Aeneas Smith that look to be about as good as anything the SEC has. And the kind of dynamic receiver play that you're used to seeing Alabama have for a good number of years, it seems like Texas A&M's kind of got that right now. And so perhaps this is me, buying into A&M again, only to be let down eventually for another prediction that turns out to be wrong. But for an Alabama team that we think we've seen some limitations for, that we think we've seen some kind of a ceiling and a cap on what its level of achievement is for this season, this feels like a pretty dangerous game for Alabama. Alabama's played much better after having lost to Texas and had the near miss there at South Florida. They've played better against SEC foes the last couple of weeks. But I think that A&M's in a pretty interesting spot here in this game. And speaking of Texas, outside the SEC, obviously the Red River shootout rivalry game between Texas and Oklahoma on tap for Saturday, too. Thus far, Texas has done everything you would expect a true and legitimate playoff contender to do. They've done everything you'd expect a team like that to do. Pretty quietly, though, Oklahoma's not been bad this season. Brent Venables starting to kind of get that feel of the kind of defense he wants to have. And at one point I thought, Jackson Arnold might kind of work his way into the starting quarterback role and kind of unseat Dylan Gabriel there. Thus far, Gabriel hasn't given you too much of a reason to put him on the bench. Oklahoma's not playing a bad brand of football in itself. I think this is a really fun game on Saturday and the final meeting between these two teams before joining the SEC next year. And as we said, Greg Sankey is planning on attending this game. So that is fun to consider, and we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let me also give a shout out here to our friends at the Finnish Long Drink. Obviously getting ready for big day-long tailgates on Saturday. The weather's been amazing, too, lately, and y'all know I like the Finnish Long Drink anywhere, anytime. But outside, when the weather's warm, I really, really like it. And today is one of those great days to be outside enjoying yourself a little Finnish Long Drink. Perhaps Saturday in Athens will be the same thing once again. Listen, whichever version of the Finnish Long Drink goes best for you in situations like that, my invitation is to go to thelongdrink.com, put in your zip code, find out where you can pick some up. Long Drink Cranberry, Long Drink Strong, 8.5% alcohol by volume. Long Drink Zero, no carbs, no sugar. The traditional in the blue can, the grapefruit flavor, the gin kick, all of that is just extraordinary. So make sure you try all of that today. Or for a limited time right here in the Peach State, you can enjoy yourself some peach-flavored version of the Finnish Long Drink. Just a wonderful, wonderful thing to do, a wonderful thing to enjoy. You can do that. Go to thelongdrink.com. Make it a big part of your tailgate and game-watching get-togethers coming up on Saturday. Finnish Long Drink goes great there on game day. So, Mike Griffith, not ready to go that kind of day for us. But you know what? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to wrap up the podcast. We're going to take some comments. And if Mike's able to join us, then we'll do that. And if not, we'll take the L and we'll move on and do it again tomorrow. All right, so Golden Shoe, always fun thing to do on any day, but especially some days. It's always nice to have something to put a smile on your face. So let's give you one here. Our buddy Joel Sidney Kelly, such a talented graphic artist, shares this. We had some nice words for Carson Beck earlier in the show. Well, Joel gives us here. You want some context for how well he's playing. Look at these numbers for previous Georgia quarterbacks in their first 5 starts. Beck at a 72% completion rate, much higher than Stetson Bennett, Jake Fromm, Aaron Murray, Matthew Stafford. Way more total yards than any of those guys. Similar number of touchdowns to guys like Fromm and Murray, the best of that group, and just 2 picks, which also makes him fewer picks through his first 5 games. Anybody else there as well. So you look at the success that all those other quarterbacks had. That's really good company for Carson Beck right now, and a very good story told in graphic form by our buddy Joel Sidney Kelly. That is good. We'll give him a golden shoe for that. Also, lousy stinking Gators. 24 days from right now, Georgia beating up on Florida in a big rivalry game. Final game for Brocktober. That's a big one on that national stage, 3:30 on CBS. We think Bowers has a big show-out moment. It comes to the hand of the lousy stinking Gators. Fun to think about that. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll look forward to talking to you then. All right, we're going to get your comments here, and we're going to forget about most of the last hour. And that's just what we do some of these times. So there you go. Fun show to start with, though. We were like rolling right along. First 20 minutes, just as good as it could be. After that, pretty big disaster. As it turns out, the happiest I was from about 10:20 on is when I was trying to explain the issue with the Apple podcast and the dilemma for those who are not getting that. As it turns out, from 10:20 on, that's about as happy as I am. So now it appears that Mike Griffith is ready. So here's what we're going to do. You can watch how all of this rolls together with the magic of podcasts later on. So when you hear this, we're going to take what we're about to record with Mike, and I got to get off the air early anyway today. I got a lot going on. We're going to take what we record with Mike. We're going to put it right there in the midst of the middle of the show, and it's going to sound like it normally does for a show. We're going to do that there. So let's do this. We'll do a little mic talk. We'll try to see if we can squeeze in a couple of your comments. And then after that, I got to bounce out of here because I got some personal stuff going on here today. So let's talk to Mike Griffith. We'll do that, and then we'll try to squeeze in a couple of your comments before we have to wrap up here for today. Here's Mike.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Time for a Georgia Farm Bureau Insider Update with Mike Griffith. Obviously, a lot to talk about when it comes to Georgia and Kentucky coming up on Saturday. Mike, though, before we get to that, I want to just take a moment to mention what we heard from former Georgia coach Mark Richt earlier this week. Fun event that DawgNation's happy to be a part of, and I know you've played a big role in helping us kind of be a part of this, and obviously we're all in great support of the causes that are near and dear to the Rick family's heart here, raising money for Parkinson's disease and obviously Crohn's disease there as well, two diseases that cause a lot of discomfort for a lot of people. And so if we can do anything to kind of get us closer to some breakthroughs and research and cure, obviously any kind of money that can be raised is huge on that. So give me a quick thought here on what's going to go down on Wednesday, October 18th. With the Dog Bowl there with Coach Rick at the bowling alley and some fun stuff going on that DawgNation's lucky enough to be a part of.
Yeah, Brandon, I'm really looking forward to that. It's going to be fun. It's going to be fun seeing you host it. You're going to be able to interview Coach Rick and Josh Brooks at the start of that. I think we're going to go around 6:30 on the 18th on the bye week on that Wednesday. So that's going to be cool to hear from Josh Brooks and Mark Richt at the front of that, and then some play-by-play bowling. I have no earthly idea how this is going to get. It sounds like it's going to be a little crazy. We don't know how crazy. I know B.J. Sweeney, our boss, is kind of holding his breath, but as long as you're holding the microphone and we've got access to players on every lane, I can't wait to see who we interview and how much fun that's going to be to see those kids having fun and in their element. They're competing for these weight belts. And, I was telling Coach Rick, I said, it's cool. There's going to be some former players there like John Stinscombe and David Green. He goes, yeah, these guys are going to be competing. He said, Pollock's going to be there. I said, oh, well, then we probably won't get Pollock. He goes, oh, no, I can make David talk. I said, oh, wow, okay, here we go. So this is going to be a fun event, different, unique, and really cool that Coach Rick chose DawgNation to be the media intermediary to live stream it. And obviously having you host it's going to be a lot of fun as well.
How much fun was it seeing Richt and Kirby together, on Monday? Two very different eras of Georgia football, and in some respects, from a personality standpoint, at times they seem, pretty different too. But we know how much respect Kirby has for Richt. Obviously, a guy that once gave him a job, and clearly, Kirby from afar saw the success that Richt was having as a precursor to the success that Coach Smart's enjoying here right now. And to see both those guys in the same building on Monday, interacting with each other a little bit, sharing some laughs. I know for me, longtime Georgia fan, really fun to see that interplay between the two, and I'm sure for you, kind of a nice thing to be in person for as well.
Yeah, magical. I mentioned to Coach Richt about the press conferences, and I knew that Kirby would do anything for him. And, Kirby's so loyal to the program, and he's so loyal to people. And like you said, Kirby was on that SEC championship staff. Coach Richt had hired him, really wanted to hire him for defense, but there wasn't a spot. So he had a running back job, and he hired him for that. The plan was to keep Kirby and move him over to defense, but obviously Kirby went with Nick Saban and the Dolphins after that 1 year. But Kirby doesn't forget people that helped, and he's got a ton of respect for Mark Richt. And,
one thing that seems to get lost a lot, in a lot of other fan bases is, well, if this coach is gone, we got to pick between these two guys, and the new guy's the good one and the old. Georgia's unique in their lineage of coaches. There's a ton of respect, and we've had Kirby on DawgNation before when we had Coach Goff on, and Kirby was a surprise guest, and obviously, Coach Donnan has been on our pro. Georgia has a very unique lineage of how their football coaches get along, and there's been very good continuity, and I think that's a big part why Georgia leads the nation in the longest active bowl streak. I mean, Georgia football has just never seemingly been bad. It's just never been bad. I mean, the down cycles really haven't been that down, and I think some of that has to do with the way the transitions have gone, the way Coach Dooley oversaw the program, and then just the individuals. And you're right, to see Kirby and Coach Rick in the same room was really cool. And Coach Rick with some really funny jokes there, Brandon, about, if in today's world the NCAA would give a guy a 2-game penalty for winning a belt, a championship belt at a charity event, a pretty clear reference to Todd Gurley. But it was fun, it was unique, and it was a historical moment, I think.
So shifting gears to Saturday's game against Kentucky, I've got respect for what this Kentucky team has done. I think the Florida game changed a lot of that for me. Early in the year, I wasn't so sure. It's undefeated record, but on a sort of game-to-game basis, not quite so sure that the Wildcats have been all that impressive. But I think after 5 games now, including an SEC win against the Gators, this is a Kentucky team that I think does what it does very well. It controls the pace, controls the clock, and yet finds a way to be, somewhat explosive within their deliberate style of play, which I think sets themselves up to be pretty dangerous on Saturday. In other words, as a Georgia partisan here, as someone who's clearly not, solely an objective observer, I want Georgia to win, and I do believe that this game's going to be tough. I think that Kentucky is going to give Georgia a pretty solid fight on Saturday. And while I expect Georgia to come out on top, I don't expect it to come on top without a fight, and I'm guessing this game probably closer than the experts think it's going to be. What's your early read on Georgia-Kentucky?
You're tipping your hand on go with the flow, BA. I'm surprised. Usually you wait until Friday to tell us that.
Yeah.
I like this game for Georgia. I like this matchup for Georgia. I think it's a good test. I think it comes at the right time. I think it's the dose of challenge that this Georgia team needs. I think at Auburn, a little bit of a slow start, and to me that was a really good win. I know I said last week I thought that would be a close game. It was. I think Georgia will win this game also. I don't know about the spread. It's kind of hard to forecast. You remember a couple years ago, Kentucky scored with like 2 seconds left to cover. I mean, they do that. I just don't think that Mark Stoops is going to out Kirby. I just don't see Kentucky able to be, especially not in Sanford Stadium, and the way the Georgia crowd answers the bell. And I think the Georgia crowd realizes that they're going to be needed Saturday. I think they are going to make a difference. I don't think Devin Leary, the transfer from NC State, has been in anything like this. And I think the Georgia crowd is going to need to answer the bell. I think they will. It's a night game. I like the matchup. Brock Bowers obviously is going to be big. But remember, to your point, that Kentucky does play him close. There's only 1 touchdown last year. Stetson about threw that pick six, and Kirby shut the pass game down the whole second half. I never thought they were going to lose last year, but that wasn't a pretty game. That wasn't a pretty game last year, and Kentucky makes it not a pretty game. They're physical. I think this Georgia team is actually a better matchup than last year's because I think Beck can whistle the ball, and also I don't think it's going to be in the 30s. So I think this is a good game for Georgia.
All right, it's our Georgia Farm Bureau Insider Update with Mike Griffith here. And, of course, Georgia Farm Bureau folks, just the same way we are, getting ready for football on the weekends. Their folks doing the same thing because they're here in Georgia just like we are. They're living, they're working, they're volunteering with their kids' school, going to youth sports, all the type of stuff that we're doing. They're doing the same thing right here in the state that we all call home here. That means when you have some sort of insurance need, they understand you as a fellow Georgian. That's when we say that Georgia Farm Bureau is always the home team. And when you check them out for their products they can offer you and service they can offer you when it comes to life insurance or home insurance or auto insurance, you'll find out just how true that really is. So please check them out online, gfbinsurance.com. That's gfbinsurance.com for more on that. All right, Mike, we're late, so we got to go here. But let me just get one more thought from you off something we talked about off the top of the program, which is the consensus I'm hearing from a lot of Georgia fans was also echoed by something that Kirk Herbstreit said on Twitter, which was that it seemed like Carson Beck kind of grew up a little bit in his first road start, the same way he probably showed some of those maturity traits in that win against South Carolina a couple of weeks prior to that. Next step in all of this might be in figuring out a way to kind of contribute to Georgia playing a little bit more consistently across the board offensively, especially first quarter where Georgia's had its issues. Do you think this Georgia offense is ready to break out in a way against Kentucky on Saturday in front of some friendly folks, night game at Sanford Stadium in a way that perhaps we haven't seen at any point in time thus far this year, at least to this point?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's the offense growing up around him. It turns out Delp ran the wrong route. We all said, he overthrew Oscar Delp, but no, Delp was supposed to bend in. It was an Oscar Delp mistake. But, the quarterback takes the blame, right? I think it's more to do with players around him. Can you get him a running game? I mean, Stetson Bennett had the benefit of a really good running game. Stetson Bennett had the benefit of two experienced offensive tackles. Georgia down their two starting, tackles from a year ago now with Broderick Jones onto the NFL, and of course you got Amarius Mims out, and then Blasky's out. You're three tackles down. You don't have a running game. You got two transferred receivers that are in their first year in the offense. Your best receiver was on a pitch count last week, and you saw what difference he made. So I think it's more about the rest of the offense. I think it's more about the skill position guys than it is about Carson Beck. I think Carson does fine. He's a distributor of the ball. He's not going to make plays with his feet like Stetson did, but I think he's a more accurate passer. He's more consistent throwing the ball. I think he makes better decisions overall than Stetson did. Remains to be seen if he can perform in the clutch like Stetson. Stetson had some pretty magical moments there, but overall, Carson more consistent, but a different type of quarterback. And maybe not the playmaker with his feet that Stetson was on occasion, doesn't bring that same threat. So it's about the rest of the offense growing up around. I think Carson's fine. I think he's a flatliner. I can't tell the emotions, like you said. I mean, he's just a different cat. But I don't think that Carson Beck is going to be the reason that Georgia loses a game. I just don't think that. I think he's fine. I think Beck's fine. I think Bobo's fine. I think it's all about the skill position players growing up and getting better around it. All
right, Mike, good stuff. Thanks for being here, part of our Georgia Farm Bureau Insider Update. We'll look forward to hearing from you again very soon. See you in Athens on Saturday.
Look forward to it, BA.
All right, so there you go. There is Mike Griffith, a little later than normal, but good to have him on the show nonetheless. We're also going to squeeze in a couple of your comments here, too. Then I got to get off the air today a little bit early. I got a couple of family things I've got to do today, unfortunately. But we are here for you. So let me go to YouTube first, take a few comments there. We'll bounce around these other comments and then get ready to go here today. And once again, for those of you who've been with us for the entire time, sorry about the issue there a little earlier. Johnny Surf Dog says Beck is playing good, better and better each week. That seems to be the consensus here right now. Georgia fans, not always the easiest bunch to win over, but it seems like right now Carson's doing a good job of doing that. Johnny also says that he thinks that Mike Bobo is calling some great games. Yeah, and listen, obviously Bobo is in the crosshairs for a lot of fans because of, what in the perception of some Georgia fans may have happened, a decade or so ago, or, certainly at least very many years ago. And, perhaps that's fair, perhaps it's not. But in terms of solely what's happened this year, I really haven't seen much of an issue specifically with Mike Bobo. Now, I think that just generally speaking, Georgia needs to score more points. So eventually, I guess that's on the offensive coordinator to a certain extent. But, the ultimate judgment on that comes a few months from now. But certainly I haven't had any issue with Mike Bobo yet. I know that was still a hot topic again after Saturday. But let's see what Georgia grows into before you kind of make any ultimate assumptions about that. Nature Gator mentioning the game for Florida against Vanderbilt. This is not a good Vanderbilt team. Vanderbilt was saltier last year. They are this year. Now, why that is, I don't 100% know. I won't pretend to be an expert on Vanderbilt's personnel. But, Vandy was winning its non-conference games a year ago, won twice in the SEC. This is not that kind of Vanderbilt team. So, Nature says they're going to make Napier resign if he loses. I would say after Saturday, that might be fair because the Vanderbilt team that beat Florida a year ago, and listen, I love making fun of Florida for losing that game, but that Vanderbilt team is much better than this Vanderbilt team is. At least I think anyway. Let's see what else. Crow King 123 says, other than some red zone issues and too many inside runs, I haven't had any issue with Bobo's play calling. So there you go. Frederick Meredith says that Kirby's the best coach in college football right now, point blank, period. I would agree with that. I think the proof is definitely in the pudding on that. Taylor Russell says it's tough to see Richt affected by such a ruthless disease. It is. And, I've been impacted by, sickness and illness of people in my family. I know many of you are too. And so I think I'm a lot more sensitive to stuff like that than I used to be. Not that I ever, hopefully, wouldn't have been sensitive to someone the caliber of Coach Richt dealing with something as heinous as what this, particular disease is. Hopefully I would always be sensitive to that. But I would say that as I get a little bit older, I'm extra sensitive to stuff like that. And it is very, very hard to see. It just seems so cruelly unfair. And yet, in the midst of that, I had a chance to interact with him a little bit one Saturday before the season began. He is just as inspiring as ever, just as friendly and fun-loving as ever. Took a lot of time with some fans, including my own son, at an autograph event, prior to the start of the year. My daughter, too, but she didn't really care. I mean, my son's the one more interested in it. And so in the midst of some very challenging circumstances, Coach Richt is just as inspiring as ever. But I totally agree with what you're saying there, Taylor. A hard thing to see. A hard thing to see. Let us see what else. Somebody said, I didn't see who said this, but if there's ever an issue in the show, you can always just take YouTube comments. That's it, right. I know you guys will always be there for us. I know you will. Scott Harris also agrees that doesn't think that Carson Beck's going to lose a game for Georgia. Yeah, I would say that right now that Beck is kind of growing into that kind of role. Like, the way I sort of judge this is that, obviously we only have a limited amount of time to talk about everything else that's going on. And so sometimes what you don't talk about is interesting, and the fact that we really haven't had much reason the last couple of weeks to talk very much about Carson Beck. Now, we've tried to give credit for some good play here. But, Beck has not needed to be a dominant topic here over the course of the last couple of weeks. And almost like the thing you say about the umpire or something like that, if you're not talking about them, that must mean they're doing their job. I think there's an extent to which the fact that Beck has not generated more chatter than he has gives you an idea of the fact that for the most part he's doing his job. All right, let's see what else. Andrew insisted on the idea of showing some of those Kirby Smart DNA traits with composure, everything like that. Yeah, we try to keep our composure. We try to. All right, let's go to Facebook. We haven't been over there. Of course, it's like warming up a 75 Buick LeSabre to get this thing to fire up on Facebook. But no, look at this. It's actually going pretty fast today. Barry Watkins said his mom battled Parkinson's before she passed away eventually, and I'm sorry to hear that. It is one of those things. It's a hard thing to watch somebody go through because there's clearly some pain. There's some tough circumstances around that, and you hate that. William Camacho says, if Carson continues to grow in the quarterback game, I don't see him losing a game. And I think that's a fun thing to consider, William. And I think I would say that the next thing I'd like to see from him, can he just crank it up? I mean, not to say that he can't, but at what point in time does Georgia allow him to make some riskier throws? I think there's a way to avoid interceptions and avoid turnover-worthy type plays that also keeps you away from getting the kind of explosive plays that can change a game for you. Do they kind of turn him loose a little bit more on some of that on Saturday? Could be a fun thing to see. Adam Henderson says to get your bowling shoes on. I guess get some bowling shoes on. I guess that's a good point. I hadn't really thought about that. If I'm going to be walking around the lanes doing the interviews, I'll need to have bowling shoes on to do that, which I actually kind of like bowling shoes. I always sort of have. But yeah, I guess I'll need to be wearing bowling shoes in order to be able to do that. Evan Roberts says, I think Ladd coming back is a lot bigger deal than we realize. I mean, he showed you on Saturday why. I mean, he's a real chain mover. He moves chains well for the Dogs. In a small amount of snaps, a guy like that can be incredibly impactful. Andrew Saltzman on the idea that he might come back. Carson Beck. Yeah, I think all of that's just kind of way too early to see. But he's clearly a man that's got a lot of options ahead for him. Ken Holcomb says a lot of the back yardage is on shorter, safer passes. Perhaps that's the case, but eventually it all kind of comes out in the wash. That if he keeps doing what he's doing all season long, no one's going to dispute the performance that he provided here. Justin McPeak on the idea of a leader such as Nakobe Dean or Nolan Smith stepping up. Yeah, I would say that spot right now is open to be grabbed. I think you're fair to point that out. I would say that spot's open to be grabbed. All right, one more time around all the comment sections. West J Dog Fan says, if I'm going to wear bowling shoes, keep in mind Dan Mullen wore clown shoes every day, which is very funny, West G. I appreciate that. Paul Moon says, I can't say that I hate any team. I very, very strongly dislike Tennessee, especially their fans. Listen, he's not a difficult thing to do, unfortunately, is dislike those folks. Nature Gator says, who has the 3:30 time slot on CBS? It's Alabama A&M, right? That's the 3:30 on CBS this week, I believe. I believe that's the case. Monkster says his only issue with Mike Bobo is when he was head coach for Fort Collins, Colorado State. Wish he had done better. Yeah, I kind of wonder about how much that era was impacted by, Mike dealt with some pretty serious health challenges for a while. My understanding is he's in much better health now than he was then, but at that period of his life, unfortunately, he was going through some pretty serious health things, I understand. Justin's got Beck throwing for 400 yards Saturday. Boy, that'd be fun to see. Barry Watkins mentioning the Phillies won last night. Yeah, I don't root for that. And when you see Zach, but because I like the Phillies to lose, it's kind of funny. Those of us who've grown to love the Eagles because of all the Georgia players, that doesn't extend to Major League Baseball at all. So I don't root for the Phillies. But I'll be honest with you. You see how Wheeler pitches for them last night. It gives you a little bit of a reminder. That can be a tough division series round for the Braves. I think it certainly could. All right, we're going to go for now. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. It's still pretty warm, so if your air conditioning is not working the way that it needs to be, get it tuned up. Factory fresh specs. Our friends at RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com. And as Mike Griffith said a moment ago, we will see them for Go with the Flow on Friday. Big picks on all the big games. Check that out there. And back here tomorrow for DawgNation Daily, presented by Breda Pest Management. We'll talk to you then, everybody.